Hello, welcome to 8.9 News. I'm Costain. Farmers and campaigners have condemned a government U-turn, which has seen ministers ditching plans to introduce mandatory animal welfare labels based on method of production for chicken meat and pork products. Fidelity Weston is the chair of CLEAR, a UK consortium of 47 food, farming and civil society organisations and businesses working together for better labelling for the environment, animal welfare and regenerative farming. I asked her what sort of labels the CLEAR Consortium want to see.
Well, I think the first thing that I should make clear is that CLEAR is not advocating for any particular label. It's advocating for some high-level principles that should sit behind all labels. So we believe that these big eco-labels that are coming on board now, and indeed any other labelling, should be mandatory, and they should include data from the farms up. So we are calling this method of production data. And until you start getting that onto labels have enormous capacity to greenwash, to not reflect the actual reality of how your food is actually produced. There's a whole range of ways in which food can be produced. You can have beef, for instance, reared on the hillsides up in Cumbria or reared in a food lot in the US. And these big labels take global synthesized data, and they're very unlikely to distinguish the two. So it's not until you get that individual farm data leading up into labels that you're really going to understand where your food comes from.
So there are two questions, I suppose, there. I mean, the first is, why is consistent and accurate food labelling so important? And the second is, how does that farm level data transfer into a method of production label that's useful for customers?
So we're not pretending this is easy, because of course you have to get the data from the farms up. So this is not going to be a straightforward business, but it's such an important principle. If we start off by neglecting that, we're going to start off with labelling systems. There are already hundreds and hundreds of different labels. It's terribly confusing for consumers. You mentioned about food not being labelled at all. That just adds to the confusion, because if you go into a supermarket and there's no label on a food, well, where do you begin to think about what to choose? So consumers are actually alienated by the existing labels. And if there was one system that everybody had to adhere to, consumers would begin to start to understand what is behind those labels. It's never going to be a panacea, but it's going to be a big help. And it's going to be the only way that consumers who need to go and shop in supermarkets and things can be connected directly back to the farms that they're buying their produce from.
And I'm just interested in what those sorts of labels might look like. And I appreciate that, you're not recommending specific labels yourself. But of course, the shell egg labelling scheme that came from the European Union has been in existence since 2004, where people can very quickly see and identify whether the eggs are from caged hens or free range, for example. And I think that there were proposals, weren't there, for chicken meat and for pork. And of course, there's been a voluntary scheme for pork labelling since 2010. Does that really need to change? Do we really need a mandatory scheme for pork labelling? And what were the chicken labels that people were interested in having delivered?
So I think on the voluntary scheme for the pork labelling, when CLEAR set up in 2020 after the Agricultural Act, we set out a manifesto and a roadmap on how we felt this could all progress. And one of the top things was to actually make that voluntary labelling mandatory for pork, because what happens is basically the poorest produced products don't get labelled at all, but the consumer's not to know that. So you go into a supermarket, some be labelled, some won't be labelled. The wording is actually quite confusing for it all. So there's a lot more clarity that could be brought to that. So I think that would be one of the first steps. A fairly easy step to do would be to make voluntary labelling schemes mandatory. On the type of labelling that you get, I mean, there's lots of different designs. And again, our skills are not in designing labels, but you see the traffic light labels. So there'll already be quite a lot of labels on foods which go A, B, C, D, E, maybe traffic lights for red, orange, green, amber, depending on how they score. So there's lots of different systems. And I think that's another thing that'd be interesting to do, is to look at, there will be loads of consumer research out there which look at how effective these labels are in actually giving the information that you want to have.
One of the beauties of the European scheme was that it was entirely objective. Nobody could say that a caged hen was not a caged hen, and likewise a free range wasn't a free range. With a traffic light system, there's an element of subjectivity in there. Is that appropriate in the normal sort of supermarket retail consumer marketplace?
Oh, I would say it definitely isn't appropriate, and that's why we need to have a level playing field, that all the labels need to say the same. How you use your data, where you get it from, data isn't an objective thing in itself, because you can choose to use some data or not others. So I don't think it's good enough to do that. And I think the main thing is that you have to start coming from the bottom up. You mentioned some of those terms like free range. That's another aspect of labeling, I think, that is very unclear at the moment. So there'll be loads of terms that are used out there: nature friendly, naturally reared, free range. Grass-fed can be put on any meat that is predominantly grass-fed. That's only 51%. The other 49% can be anything. So even the terms that are currently used are extremely misleading to the consumer, and they really should be regulated in order to help consumers make fair choices, and choices that enable them to support the climate, social issues, whatever it is they feel strongly about.
So industry had been expecting this, you'd been expecting this, but now the government's changed its position. What is its current position?
Oh, it's really very, very depressing. I mean, in 2020, the Agricultural Act went through. That was the first time that the UK had its own Agricultural Act because of Brexit. We'd previously, all of our policy had come from Europe. And in that, they said, and Lord Bennion at the time said, they would be consulting on the use of labels and regulations around that. To be perfectly honest, since then, they just dragged their feet. And we never did get a proper consultation on environmental labels. They started off, they did a consultation on animal welfare, which is all well and good, although CLEAR's approach is that don't keep siloing these things. We need to have labels. People don't just want animal welfare labels, they want environmental labels. They want to know how their food's produced, to try and start to take a holistic approach to it. But anyway, the animal welfare labelling consultation went ahead, and I mean, I've got the letter here from the DEFRA saying that they're not going to go ahead with it, and in it says that they received over 1,600 responses to that. The evidence provided suggested that there is a public appetite for improved animal welfare labelling. However, we do not consider the time is right to consult on proposals to reform labelling for animal welfare. So they're basically ignoring what the public want. They're just dragging their feet. They go on to say that we intend to continue working with industry to explore how we can harness the market to improve food information for consumers and raise animal welfare standards. As part of this, we will continue to gather evidence on the impacts of a wide range of market interventions, as well as how they would align with wider labelling proposals such as eco-labelling. The reality is that the general public don't trust the market, and for very good reason. And I think so long as the government fails to get involved in this, there's a policy gap, and the big players in it are just going to continue to ride roughshod and frankly just provide labels that suit their means, which is not to distinguish different methods of production.
So government seemed to want it in the past. The public clearly wanted it. What do you think it was that led to this decision not to regulate, not to bring in mandatory labelling?
I think it was a political decision. I also feel we've spoken to the DEFRA civil servants a lot. I think they're in favour of labelling. I think everybody can see how valuable it would be, but it's a political decision that's come from this government, which is that they don't want it. They've been lobbied, as has the opposition, incredibly hard by the large food manufacturers, and I have to say, very disappointingly, by the NFU too, who it's not in their interest to see products being distinguished at a farm level, because you start to get people being more interested in what is the difference between one type of production than another.
Now, you mentioned the opposition earlier on, and of course the UK election isn't far away. So what are the Labour and Liberal Democrat positions currently on labelling?
I think all politicians, from having spoken to them, are being lobbied extremely hard by the big food manufacturers and the NFU to not do labelling, just to leave it alone as it is. So I think that's what they're coming up against. Obviously, with not knowing whether they're going to be in power or not. I can understand that labelling is not exactly going to be top of their agenda, but I think we would hope that should they get into power, that there's enough common sense there, enough of a desire to see that there's so much in place to ensure that there is good labelling going in. The civil servants, I'm pretty sure, are behind it all. We at CLEAR are going to be doing some research, which we hope will feed into this whole system of understanding about these big labels. The government has set up the Food Data Transparency Partnership, which again is there to look at these issues, and with the right political leadership, maybe if we've got the building blocks underneath in place, once a new government comes in, we can really persuade them to push up the political agenda and make it happen. I think we shouldn't give up, but we just need to keep on working behind the scenes and have absolutely no hope at all that this government's going to do anything about it.
That was Fidelity Weston from CLEAR. More about this and our other headline news on our website, 8point9.com. That's all for now. We're back very soon. Thanks for watching.